I'm joined by Kiel Williams, Senior Data Scientist with Decision Desk HQ. Kyle, great to have you on this morning. Let's focus on crime for a minute, and specifically Philadelphia, because just within the last few days, Wawa, the convenience store, pulled out several locations from Philadelphia. The mayor there saying it's not because of crime. How important is crime right now, motivating voters to head to the polls in a few weeks? And which party is doing a better at convincing people, I have a plan, we'll figure this out?
So most voters, if you ask them, is crime important in driving your vote this coming November? A large majority of voters will say it's at least somewhat or very important. And that's true among Democrats and Republicans, that something like 57, 58% of Republicans in our polling indicate that crime is very important for determining their vote in November. And even among Democrats, that number's in the 40s, that something like 40% of Democrats will indicate that crime is very important in determining their vote. But something we like to emphasize is that true single issue voters around crime, inflation, or anything else are pretty rare. That any voter you talk to, crime is something they're going to consider, but it's very rarely going to be something they look at in isolation. They're going to look at how does a candidate deal with issues like crime in conjunction with things like inflation and, of course, abortion, given how things have gone recently.
A lot of the blame is on local politicians, leaders of different cities, LA, I'm thinking of, Chicago as well, on some rising crime. How much blame do voters put on the president and the White House for crime nationwide?
So in some of our polling, we've seen that a large majority of voters, I believe something like 70% of voters ascribe at least a lot or some, like something like 50% of voters ascribe some or a lot of responsibility to President Biden in terms of crime. But again, you have to look at that holistically, that voters might hold Biden responsible for crime, but that's going to be in conjunction with other things. That there may be a lot of voters, especially Republican voters, who are unhappy with Biden's performance on crime, but that's going to be something they're going to look at in conjunction with inflation, economic indicators, things around abortion. So really, you have to look at unhappiness around rising crime together with how voters feel about other things that are going on simultaneously.
Yeah, and inflation, the economy, how much everything costs, that is the number one issue for so many people. Kyle, you know that. One woman I saw on our morning program today said, I want somebody in office who understands what I'm going through, who can sympathize. Which party is doing a better job at sympathizing with the problems, the budgets that are strapped thin right now, trying to get food on the table, put gas in the car?
So just looking at crime as a specific example, Republicans have an advantage among voters in terms of who do voters trust more on crime, that by, I think, 7 or 8 points, voters in our polling indicate they trust Republicans more than Democrats on the issue of crime. But there's a huge distinction between how do Republicans feel about crime and how do Democrats feel about crime. That when you ask a Democrat, how do you feel about crime, they may indicate they're concerned, but they might do that through the prism of things like gun violence, things like mass shootings. Whereas when you ask a Republican, how do you feel about crime, they might indicate concern, but then cite issues around things like street violence and sort of inner city violence. So even though a Republican and a Democrat might both indicate concern around crime, they're thinking about that issue through a very different prism.
Right. My question, though, is on inflation. Which party do you think is doing a better job at sympathizing with voters on the economy, which is a driving force that will send them to the polls?
So I think you see some variance between different states and different locations around that. Broadly speaking, voters in our polling indicate greater trust toward Republicans around the issue of inflation specifically. There's some anger and frustration in the broader electorate around how Joe Biden and Democrats have handled inflation and economic issues. But again, that's something that varies significantly by party. If you ask someone who's a Democrat, they will look and see things like the Inflation Reduction Act as things that indicate that Biden and congressional Democrats are doing a good job on inflation. While if you ask a Republican, they might look at those same sorts of legislative achievements and see things that Joe Biden and Democrats are doing to drive inflation. So overall, voters tend to trust Republicans right now more on the issue of inflation. But if you break that out by party, really the partisanship that someone approaches the issue with determines a lot about how they're going to interpret events they see in the news cycle.
Broader question for you here, Kyle. Are these midterms more about motivating the base, right, getting away from some of the extremists, however, or is it reaching independents, right, the undecideds right now who are on the fence?
So I think that's sort of getting at this question of, is winning a midterm election more about turnout or more about persuasion? You often hear that that winning an election day is all about turnout, but I like to push back on that. There do exist persuadable voters. There do exist persuadable voters out there, and we saw that in 2020. There were lots of Cuban voters in the south of Florida who really did change their mind and become more conservative. There really were a lot of persuadable voters in the suburbs of Atlanta who disliked what they saw in Donald Trump's presidential administration and became more liberal and voted for more Democratic candidates. So I think even though in today's highly polarized political environment, there aren't that many persuadable voters, there are enough independents who might really go either way to determine some of these very, very close elections in places like Georgia and Pennsylvania and Nevada.
Yeah, Hispanic voters, women voters, young voters, all important in this election. Kiel Williams, Senior Data Scientist with Decision Desk HQ. Good to have you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.